to AUP. Welcome to AUP. This is our sort of home base now. I feel much better without a tie. But we have some really exciting papers, and I just wanted to get us started so that we could have more discussion. I know some of the other panels we didn't really have much time for discussion, so I'm sure these papers are going to be very rich, so we can have more time to talk. But let me just first introduce the first presentation, which is from Martin Beddeleem, who's a postdoctoral researcher at the School of Culture and Society at Aarhus University. He has completed his dissertation on the epistemology in scientific politics and early neoliberalism at the University of Montreal in 2018. He is leading the digital database Mapping the Good Society, Concepts, Actors, and Institutions, Neoliberalism from the 1930s Onwards, which will be launched this year. And he has a forthcoming chapter in the edited volume, The 9 Lives of Neoliberalism, which is going to be published next year at Versa Press. And the chapter is called Recoding Liberalism, Philosophy, and Sociology of Science Against Planning. And the co-author of this paper is Hagen Schulz-Forberg, who teaches global and European history at the School of Culture and Society, also at Aarhus University. He has written on intellectual networks of the League, on the history of economic thought, European integration and approaches to global conceptual history. From 2013 to 2016, he led the collaborative research project Towards Good Society, Constructing the Social Through the Economic since the 1930s at Aarhus University. And he also has a forthcoming article, book chapter with the Cambridge History of Modern European Thought, which has the title Modern Economic Thought and the Good Society. That'll be coming out this year in 2019. So, warm welcome to you.
Thank you. All right. Well, can you hear me? I have a little secret microphone. I'm gonna do my talk a little bit while standing up because I need to move those slides here. So thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to have our 20 minutes of revisionism to share with you. I guess we have quite a few revisions to make here, but what I want to start off with is to explain a little bit the title of where we're going here, because in discussions with colleagues here the days before, we got the question quite often, in neoliberalism, what does that have to do with Versailles? And so I had to come up with an answer to that. As you can see, there are two places in Paris in the title, which is both in Paris, Versailles and the Palais-Royal. So the first trivial pursuit question to you would be, what happened at the Palais-Royal? Does anybody know from heart? Probably not. But for us, it's important because that is the landmark of, with all the neoliberal nerds that are around, where the Walter Lippmann colloquium took place. It was at the Palais-Royal, and in the Palais-Royal was the headquarters of the International Institute for Intellectual Cooperation, which was the organizational institution within which the Walter Lippmann colloquium took place. So within the historiography and scholarship on neoliberalism, we find the Walter Lippmann colloquium as a prequel, usually, here is the first revisionism, a prequel to a story that unfolds in the post-war, that is the second post-war, through a handful of economists that organize more and more and start to win over the ears of the powerful by the 1970s. And so we were interested in that prequel by asking the question, who was actually at this Walter Lippmann colloquium besides the well-known figures of Hayek and Mises and maybe Röpke and Rusto, some of these you probably know, but who were those 25 others? And what did they do there? And why were they so vocal when you read the verbal protocol, the Berlin Protocol? What was going on there? What is this IIIC organization doing? How can we contextualize this? So as you can see, we're sort of walking back from the post-war, the 40s and 50s to the late 30s, and then we realize, as we need to contextualize those actors and institutions, we need to understand much better the incredible complexity of the League of Nations web of institutions, policymaking and knowledge experts, which emerges from Versailles. So if you wish, Versailles is the focal point or one of the emerging points, both in terms of peace and war. It's the end of the war, which was a very important experience for early neoliberal actors, because that trauma of the war really took them on a personal level, also, of course, then on a more academic level, they would say this could never happen again. We should never be unprepared, which is one of the logics of the whole League of Nations policy and expert system. Never again, not in the sense of the post-war, but never again should we be without a plan. Okay, we had no answers to the post-war situation when crisis hit us. This could never happen again. We need to have something in the drawer. And they had an incredible amount of experts doing that job. And the other important thing of the peace, so the war is one thing and the peace is another thing, that inspired the early neoliberals, because in a sense, what then crystallized by the late 1930s in an agenda of liberalism, which they called Agenda of Liberalism, and they agreed on in the late 1930s, was of course incentivized by tasks, questions, general themes, semantics of that interval period. Much of the questions that they would address: what is the relation between peace and the market? What is how can we have collective security? How can we have peaceful change? All of these questions were addressed within the web or within that institutional network of the League, and also picked up by the early neoliberals. Finally, another revisionist point that we're making, we're trying to work on the concept of early neoliberalism, because you need to understand that it's quite different from contemporary neoliberalism. First of all, very simply, it's a self-declared agenda. So they actually call themselves neoliberals. As a matter of fact, when you read in some of the protocols, what happened at the London Colloquium at the Palais-Royal is that they took a majority vote. They decided on 5 points, the agenda of liberalism, and then, as you can imagine, there's a bunch of economists and intellectuals that disagree on everything. And so they were, how do we call this? And there were various proposals: social liberalism, liberalism of the left, and then no, we shouldn't have a political flag here, and that's very essential. Again, that it's not supposed to be political; it's supposed to be above politics. So they took a majority vote and said, let's call it neoliberalism. Yeah, some disagreed, some agreed. So that's sort of the introduction to that link between Versailles and the Palais-Royal. Many of those things actually happened in Paris. But I'm going to start talking a little bit more about some general points and some more content-related points, and then we will have Martin taking over, explaining a little bit the whole actor network institutions relations that we've been working on. And we heard a lot about the transnational approach. These days, the way we try to operationalize it is by looking at the combination of actors, institutions, and concepts. So these three interrelated approaches for us operationalize that transnationalism. If we want to look at the inspiration or the experience behind much of what inspired the early neoliberals, here are some 3 quotes from key actors within early neoliberalism. One is Michael Polanyi, the very first one. I mean, they're all very, I'm not going to read all of them, I hope you can enjoy some of them. But what transpires from that is, for example, here, we have Willem Ruck saying at the bottom that this is all about, the First World War started it all. And even 25 years later, as we kept working and building and rebuilding, I feel like I've always been pursued by the battlefields of Picardy. Hayek, this is the young Hayek as a soldier in the Austro-Hungarian army. He would also say, well, it's the First World War that really is the decisive influence here. In Polanyi's quote, we can already see that, what is the proposed solution? How can we rethink a global order in a way that it works in a better way? And he points to a very important idea which reverberates or echoes in all of the networks and in most of the publications and discussions. Internal cooperation, a closed system of law and order among European states. How do we solve that riddle of relations between nation states and national order and an international order? That was the main question. How do we construct a national society or a national economy that is conducive to international peace? And how do we construct an international organization that is conducive to national peace? These elements are absolutely crucial. If we want to just summarize some of the, let's say, as we move from Versailles to Palais-Royal, many things happened within the League of Nations and within that network. And as you can see here on the left, well, this is just a random, not random, of course, but this is just a summary of many of the important things that filter in and have a big influence on early neoliberalism and the way these economists and actors thought and provided some of their ideas. It's a mix of national sovereignty. Of course, we have the heritage of colonialism and empire. How do we deal with that? With the emergence of the nation state as empires are on their way out, not all of them, but some of them. Dealing with minority questions, with general emotional identities, national identities, minority identities, how do we integrate them into a revitalized liberalism? And this was very important. And it also gives a hint of how they were organized. I mean, not just a handful of guys, coming, hanging out in the salons of Vienna, who would then move on, but they were deeply embedded in these networks. I think this is one of the main points that we are showing also with the database that Martin is working on, that we find all of those participants of the Lippmann Colloquium dispersed within those networks. And if we follow just some of those major trends or lines within the interworld, the Disarmament Commission, the mandate system, the preparation agency, economic and financial sections, we meet our actors there, we meet our neoliberals there, as they are in dialogue with contesting ideas, with fascism, with old school liberalism, with maybe a bit of a too socially constructed liberalism, let's say the new liberalism from Britain of the early 20th century. So neoliberalism emerges in contestation with other points of view as it tries to come up with a solution to a common task, which is how do we build that global order? What should be key conditions on which we build that? Here in the blue, in the elaboration of principles of governance, how do we run that order? We just summarized a couple of the main ideas behind much of the writing in early neoliberalism. International law is in there. Collective security is absolutely crucial, as of course war needs to be avoided. And one of the solutions that they grapple with and write a lot about is the federal solution. Federalism and early neoliberalism go hand in hand in many ways. Variations of it, they don't all agree on how to organize that federalism, yet it should be a federal construction. Why? Because if we want a collective security, we need to have some form of shared sovereignty on various levels. What parts of sovereignty should be shared? There's disagreement on that within the literature, but still, that's a very important factor here as well. And of course, economic integration is seen as the one, mechanism that would propel, a peaceful societies into a peaceful future. Through a common economy, a larger market, societies could be sustained in a better way, and the social could be controlled, which is something that we pick up later as we go into more detail of those sentences. There's lots of trouble about the social control. That doesn't mean that they want to be oppressive in any way, but they just want to avoid mass outrage, too much poverty, make sure that societies wouldn't slip out of that liberal paradigm again and maybe move into another form of configuration of being communist or fascist. And on the right, and the way they did it, we also learned in one of the talks yesterday, one of those brilliant overviews, how many experts were already at Versailles. I forgot the numbers, I wanted to write it down. It was like 952 committees, and it was amazing. So Versailles is also the Urknall of the birth of this expert and policy-making network. And it is the neoliberals that live within that network very, very bigly, it's a Trump, it's Trumpism, very strong. And they're in this network. And this is just a list of some institutions where we find them, where they publish. For example, the New Commonwealth Institute is attached to the IIIC as well. The New Commonwealth Institute is the place where Hayek publishes his first version of the interstate federalism, of the article on interstate federation, which is seen by some, particularly Wolfgang Streeck, as like one of the foundational essays for European Union Common Market. It's in their pan-European movement, a much more conservative Christian, Catholic, organized or oriented movement. We find some of the neoliberals and the post-war organized in there. Find the Federal Union. This is a big effort in the early war years, headed by Lord Beveridge, William Beveridge and others, in order to push a global federal organization. We also find Lionel Robbins, many of the French economists involved and attached to that organization. Bank for International Settlements, hugely important, founded in 1930, early 30s. We again find many of the actors related to that, and so on and so forth. We could go on. The Danubian Studies Group is also quite important, and which tried to deal with, again, the Central European question in economic and social ways. So how could we, it was one of the first projects, I would say, where we can find like a transnational governance structure trying to come up with normative ideas of how to design institutions in order to make sure that the economy is running in a certain way so that societies remain peaceful. So that the social institutional engineering idea based on data gathering, which would be coordinated by the Austrian Business Cycle Institute in Vienna, which was of course founded by Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek in the 1920s, and so on and so forth. The story gets deeper. The International Chamber of Commerce, we learn about this organization a lot in Quinn Slobodia's recent book on early neoliberalism as well. Now, if we then want to understand the organization of the IIIC and of this network in a better way, this is just a map which we stole from, well, with his consent, from Martin Grandjean, we're allowed to, of where we can find national committees of intellectual cooperation globally by when, actually, by the 1930s. The way they were organizing this huge network is that there's, you can imagine like a center in Geneva with the Geneva Institute of International Studies, the Graduate Institute, and a couple of other more transnationally oriented and organized think tanks and research institutes like the Pacific Institute, what's it?
Institute of
Pacific Relations, exactly. And then they would find, and in each member state of the League, they would found these national centers for cooperation. And if there was a task, like a research task, for example, the simple question was the relation between peace and the economy, it would flutter through that system, and each national committee of intellectual cooperation would then, talk to or divide the tasks among themselves and say, okay, here are our national expert institutions. Each of those national committees had particular institutions connected to those. And in the case of Britain, it was the LSE as the major spider in the web. It was Chatham House. In France, it was Sorbonne, and it were a couple of think tanks or research institutes specialized in social and economic research, and so on and so on. You can go through the countries. In the countries where there weren't any institutions in place, they would be founded. For example, in the case of Spain, in the case of Czechoslovakia, they would be built up. In other cases, already existing institutions of this kind of research or elite making would come up. So it serves two causes. It provides knowledge and policy. It generates all of these reports and memos, which the archive is full of. They come from this web, which I hope I've illustrated in some way. We can talk about it later in more detail when we then zoom in and try to find where do these neoliberals hang out, where do they move in. We see a very important organization, which is the IIIC, and within the IIIC, another organization that evolves slowly over the 20s. I mean, it's very chaotic in the 20s as it starts to sort of move into place. They start to look for funding. They're not really very well organized, but they start to be really well organized and like an incredible knowledge-making and research machine by the early 30s. The amount of memos and the amount of academic input is just mind-blowing, coming from everywhere. Throughout the League's web. And what is then founded is something that's called the International Studies Conferences. That's sort of like a very special organization within the IIIC, run by Paris mostly. That has annual meetings. And within those annual meetings, as you can see, these meetings echo the general intellectual and political questions of the time. You can also see how they are not very well organized in the beginning and start to have their, the way they want to run their show. First, that's a good idea. Let's have these conferences. Yeah, let's meet again next. We don't know how to do it yet. But then the Rockefeller Foundation got a little bit angry that, hey, we're funding all of this, so you should be a bit more effective. They hired John Conliffe in order to organize this and to whip them into shape. And then they decided on a biannual theme, so one theme for 2 years should be treated. And it starts to really then fall into shape with the 32 Milan conference. And as you can see, those themes really echo what then is translated finally and crystallizes into the agenda of liberalism in 38. State of economic life, collective security, peaceful change, economic policies in relation to world peace. The 40 and 41 conferences, which of course didn't happen because of the war, they were supposed to be on international organization. So how do we feature all that into international organization? Yeah. So this would be my little introduction on the main themes and topics of early neoliberalism. And now Martin is going to talk a little bit more about the Moderator and colloquium as an illustration of this complex web.
Sure. I think one point that we've been driven that you've been driving since the start, that this was not at all, we shouldn't see the Walter Lippmann colloquium as the start, the beginning of early neoliberalism, but it already converges there from those various networks and policy expertise. And these are the portraits of all the participants to the Walter Lippmann colloquium, and plus those that were invited that did not, couldn't come. As you can see, they're all male and all white.
Just like most of us. Just like most of us.
Like most of us. And one thing that got me interested into neoliberalism is how diverse the cast is. Of course, we find later neoliberals very famous, like Hagen and others. But we also have philosophers, sociologists, people who were intellectuals. So early neoliberalism was surprisingly ecumenical. It was not something that was radical or seen as a kind of congregation of economists who were all agreeing into one agenda. On the contrary, when we read the proceedings and the protocol, we realize that they disagreed not only on how they should call themselves, but on precise policy solutions. And so, in a way, the League model of this expert discussion through thematic session and trying to devise together a solution that could be compromised is something that is also taken up at the Walter Lippmann colloquium. It's a model of production of ideas with which they're familiar and with which they duplicate and really emphasize in their work. What's important for them, it's not really goals, precise aims, but really the ways into which we talk and the common framework and principles into which then the precise agenda and solutions are going to be implemented. Why I show this portrait is because on the next slide, I'm going to show you somehow where do all these people come from and how does it all make sense to live in Paris at that time. And Geneva, and especially the Institut Universitaire des Hautes Études Internationales, which became the Graduate Institute as we know it today, has been a central place for the construction of and the revision of liberal thought in the 20s and early 30s. As we can see, a lot of those people have permanent position. Rapin was the director of the institute, of course, and here we see Etienne Montour, Alain Chatriot talked about yesterday briefly, who was the son of Paul Montour, who was the co-director of the institute. Mises Rupke had a permanent position there, and then Rapin was very smart in that, of course, he couldn't get a huge faculty. It was still a very tiny institute, but he organized every summer temporary classes. People, experts invited from everywhere in the world would come and talk to the students for 1 month, for a couple of days, on the thematic they would choose, and that really helped gelling together the idea that we would draw expertise on specific topic from the best people and have them meet in Geneva in tandem with the work of the League, because obviously the Graduate Institute was both funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. Its whole budget came from the Rockefeller, not the whole budget, but most of the budget came from the Rockefeller Foundation, which is why Tracy Kittredge is such an important figure in those interwar network. And at the same time, and in the end, Louis Rougier, who would be the organizer of the Walter Lippmann Colloquium, wrote his 2 major books on liberalism while giving classes in Geneva. So it is not that even the main reference books, the main theoretical construction, came in direct relations with the participation to a much larger intellectual environment. So that's one of the important bases. Another important basis we talked about was the IIIC and this whole environment around the very, of course, administrative, relatively structured League of Nations Intellectual Cooperation. And here again, most of the participants to the Lippmann Colloquium were linked one way or another with the work of the ICIC and the IIIC. For example, one of the forgotten pieces in the literature was why this José Castillejo was such a vocal participant to the colloquium while he was not really well known. Well, it's because he was sitting on the board, he was a board member of the International Committee for Cooperation in Geneva. That was the case as well for Huizinga, which is an important intellectual figure that couldn't come to the conference. And maybe even more importantly and more specifically, when we move to more detailed observation of what were the affiliation of those people and in what kind of network they were moving, we realized that the idea of think tank, which today is also linked to a later development of neoliberalism and the creation of the Institute of Economic Affairs and all, but preceding that, already in the interwar period, there is this idea that we need to construct new center for policy expertise, for policy construction, and the early neoliberals were very much invested into the creation of those institutions that were somehow, that allowed for those ideas and options not to be expressed in the political and diplomatic context of the League, but more through apolitical expert networks. And for example, that's how we can make sense of the participation of someone like Raymond Aron, who was an early member of the Centre de Documentation Sociale founded by Célestin Boublé in Paris. We can see that someone like Robert Marchelin, who would be a key figure to the OECD, I don't know if it's in English, yeah, was himself a very, very well-connected person at that time in the early 30s as a young graduate. Charles Rist, who did not participate in the colloquium, was key in funding the Institut Scientifique de Recherche économique et sociale, whom Hayek mentioned, the Austrian Business Cycle Institute. This was the French equivalent, also funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, in this drive and effort to gather economic and social data to be able to generate, of course, solutions that would be widely accepted by everyone, but solutions that had a scientific grounding, that were in line with the modern scientific ideas and scientific theories about economics and society. A couple of other interesting, two other, for example, the International Institutes for Public Finance, which still exists today. His first secretary was André Piatier, who remained an important figure there for like, I think 1 or 2 decades, and whom Rapart and Hayek were founding members as well. The Bank for International Settlements. Marcel van Zielen was the head of banking, was the brother of Paul van Zielen, the Belgian prime minister, when it was founded. And Auboin became the director of the bank in '38. So we can see that it testifies both to how neoliberalism was born, but also the wider reach of neoliberal idea and its dissemination in these institutions later on. Like, it did not just congeal in one group, one think tank, and then had regular meetings at the Montparnasse Society and then developed. On the contrary, those ideas were created and then disseminated through various places. I don't think I have much time left. I just wanted to show you the agenda of liberalism on which they voted and agreed to make it a foundational document for their intellectual movement. That's still how they considered themselves in '38. They thought they really had to react against the rise of totalitarianism. And here we can see a key, as we showed at the beginning, here we can see a clear articulation of some of the principles they were at least agreeing on. And it had, the shape of those ideas is nothing like later neoliberalism. First of all, we can see that the state and the legal regime is the key framework, the key articulation on which everything, the linchpin somehow, on which everything hangs. And of course, as Hagen said, the legal system is a method of social control. What they mean by that is that the rule of law should prevail. There shouldn't be, and it's a way of kind of removing politics, or parliamentary politics, or street politics, from impeding into how a liberal transnational system would work. And we can see that they're very open to the idea that the state should contribute to redistribution, should take a certain number of tax to be able to provide social services. The only important caveat is that this has to be done with respect to how the price mechanism works. The state can obviously tax, but should not tax in a way that is working in contradiction with the price mechanism. How are we on time?
I feel good.
You feel good?
I can take over the last slide.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. As we zoom out from the Lippen colloquium, from that agenda, which had these 5 points, the price mechanism, 3 points related to the rule of law, and the final point on redistribution. If we have a state that is constructed in such a way, then that state is allowed to tax for 5 fields. And then there was a big discussion ensuing as well, how do we do all this? And how do we implement all this? And if we then zoom out into the larger, let's say, philosophical and ideological discussions around that agenda, you can see on the left here, we try to summarize it in some more visual ways, more foundational ideological concepts, which is the very fundamental viewpoint that it's all man-made. Now, this may sound odd or normal or banal today, but for economists, of course, at that time, it was still sort of not news, but yeah, well, we're making that order. It's not we're not observing nature, we're not finding out the rules, we're making that order. And don't let the communists and the fascists and others run away and make these orders based on values which are wrong values. There would be an interesting division between false and true values, between false and true science, between false and true interpretations of those final things. So it's a man-made order, and much of the neoliberal debate also revolves around values, the value basis, what should be the value base. And here we see a relation to the humanism at the time, the human inviolability as something like der letzte Grund, as Szabla would call it, or the final norm, the basic norm, on which everything needs to be constructed and towards which everything needs to be legitimized in return. So if we build a social order, an economic order, it can only be justified by stage kind of going back to that basic norm. It almost sounds like Kelsen. Of course, there's disagreement here among some of them. As I've summarized them as legal positivists, which is what Rougier and others would openly say, well, this is, if we construct that liberalism again, it's basically a legal positivist construction because we all agree on certain norms which feed into our constitutional order. And this is also the solution of the time. If we want to avoid politics, politics is bad. Politics is what fascists are doing, and special interest, arbitrary decisions. Politics needs to be tamed. Politics needs to be contained. So we move economy. We try to take it away from politics as much as possible and put it on the constitutional level. So the solution was to merge economics with the constitutional, with law on the constitutional level, and then build that framework encasing that market, right? And in order to give politics a little bit of space, but not too much, creating that normative framework, which we would call economic constitutionalism there on the right. Federations seem to be a great way of getting that organized. Plus international economic organizations that will oversee, that would continuously generate expertise and scientific knowledge on these questions. And so if we then say this is about governance in some ways, well, it goes back to the points that we're trying to make in the beginning about national order in relation to international order. They need to be mutually sustainable by having the price mechanism in some ways, of course, in some parts, not in all parts. This is the big discussion. Where do we draw the line? Where's the common good best reached through the market or through having it under control of the state? Rule of law, shared sovereignty, and that world of intergovernmentalism and think tanks and organizations is key as well. And with this, I would conclude our paper. Thank you very much for listening.
For that really exciting paper, really learned a lot. So next up is First Loksabha, who is a doctoral researcher at Cornell University and a research lecturer at Cornell Law School. Next year, he will be a fellow of the Council for European Studies. His research focuses on the history of international law and global governance, and he particularly focuses on issues related to migration.
Can you hear me?
Sure. No, I can hear you.
Okay. Thank you so much for being here this morning, and I want to thank everyone for their participation in the conference so far. I have the extraordinary privilege to be standing on the shoulders of everyone else who has laid the kind of background for a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, and so I'll be trying to allude to as much of that as possible as I go along. I also have the privilege of kind of building on the background of previous reappraisals of the Versailles Treaty and the Paris Peace Conference. And I don't think we've talked very much about some of these earlier reappraisals from 25 years ago in the 90s. But I wanted to kind of look back when I was thinking about how they impacted the governance of migration and see how earlier reappraisals kind of looked at that as well. And one thing I discovered is that they did not talk very much about migration specifically. But one thing that led me to was this fascinating quote from Thomas Mann in the midst of the revolutionary upheavals in Munich in 1919. Mann saw the upheavals as a mass migration from below. It was threatening Western civilization. He said it was Germany's duty to prevent this from happening. Okay, we can see this sort of metaphorically, right? We can think of this as sort of, okay, there is kind of a social upheaval from the lower classes, producing the communist uprising in Munich. That is a kind of conceptual mass migration. But actually, many actors at the time were conceptualizing the uprisings in Munich and elsewhere as a product of actual migrations taking place in the wake of the First War. And one thing that we don't talk about very often, we talk about the border shifts that happen in the wake of the conflict, is sort of how they affected how borders were policed. We talk a lot about where the borders are, where they're drawn, but we don't talk about kind of qualitatively what happens to the facilities, what happens to the kind of infrastructure of the border when it's displaced to another location. And what happens in Germany is that it becomes very difficult to actually police the eastern frontier in particular. And so you get not only masses of people arriving from former German territories into the new borders of the German state, for example, you get masses of refugees from other locations, particularly in the wake of the Russian Civil War. And these come in addition to forced laborers that had already flooded Germany that were needed for the war effort. They come in addition to demobilized soldiers that are coming in the wake of the conflict as well. And this is not just happening in Germany, it's repeated in many states throughout Europe. And this is a kind of clumsy term of art I use, a kind of crisis of immobility in which you have a lot of populations that have kind of moved around and are stuck actually when borders begin to congeal again in the wake of the war. And so you have this kind of paradox where you have people who were mobile populations, they need to kind of move out of these countries in order to find employment, given the kind of economic crises that are taking place in these countries. But you have intensified borders, again, that arise that prevent them from doing so. And so you have them kind of trapped there, and there are fears throughout Europe, and I think Margaret McMillan really laid this out really well in her keynote yesterday. Fears of political instability as a consequence of the kind of economic crises that are taking place, and they're extraordinarily exacerbated and driven to a kind of xenophobic panic by the fact of all of these migratory populations kind of congealing within the spaces, the new spaces of these new territories that are created after the war. Okay, so what I could do right now is go immediately to the Paris Peace Conference, go immediately to the Versailles Treaty, and talk about the internationalist solutions that are proposed for this problem. But I want to follow the injunction of this conference and look at the broader context in time and space in which this is set. And I want to look in particular at an earlier multilateral solution to increasingly closed borders that affected migrants worldwide. And this had to do with kind of, this might seem a bit out of the box, but with disease control, particularly concerns about cholera. And so in the 19th century, fears of cholera were widespread. And kind of the particular fear was that you had this disease that was arising in India that was being carried by mobile populations into Europe and then beyond Europe into the Americas. And so you had one route, right, that led from India, that was carried by people on pilgrimage on the Hajj from South Asia to Mecca, and then people who would come on the Hajj from North Africa and the Ottoman Empire were carried into Europe. And then another route, particularly important, that was seen as kind of moving through Central Asia and the Middle East and into Russia, and then carrying cholera through Eastern Europe. So what was the solution that kind of international policymakers came up with to engage this problem? Well, you might imagine that they wanted to protect Europe in particular, protect the borders of 19th century states from disease.
But actually, states proved very adept at shutting down their borders in the wake of these calamitous cholera outbreaks. And so the real problem was trying to figure out a means by which, in the increasingly connected, fluid world of 19th century commerce, you could maintain those connections while at the same time protecting states from disease. So how is this going to take place? Well, in the International Sanitary Conventions, this international regime that emerges is an attempt to kind of balance these two things. And one way to do it, and I want to take the example of the 1893 Dresden Convention, which has not been worked on very much. One way to do it is to say, okay, we'll let goods and commerce sort of speed through borders, but immigrants will leave it up to the discretion of states. They're the kind of problem that they're the kind of disease vector that's causing these problems. But here's the issue. For shipping companies, immigrants were commerce. They were goods. And so you have to figure out some means by which they can be moved across the border as well, while keeping society safe from infection. Okay, so in Germany, which is kind of a major transit zone for Eastern European migrants coming across Europe from Eastern Europe, from Russia, there's a kind of ad hoc solution that's worked out between shipping companies and the Prussian state in particular, in which the shipping companies accept liability for the migrants that they're moving through, but they have to maintain border posts. They have to come up with a means to secure their facilities against disease breaking out into the broader German society, basically. And what the German government does is take the kind of purpose of the International Sanitary Conventions and codify it in a way that allows this kind of principle to be applied throughout the German Empire. And so what you get is a kind of regulation that sets out how exactly you can move migrants through Germany quickly without having to compromise security against disease. And this requires a significant degree of control on those migrants. So in this regulation from 1904, you can see they can only cross a certain border post, which is kind of novelty for the period. They have to be transported in special trains, special wagons, and this is all to ensure that they never come into contact with the general German population. They have to be completely isolated and segregated from them. And these are sort of diagrams of what this system looks like. So you can see here the special border posts on the eastern frontier. There are kind of intermediate posts where migrants are checked as well in the center of the country. And then at ports you have special facilities that further ensure that before they're shipped off to wherever they're migrating to eventually, they're kind of cleaned of disease and insured. And there's an attempt to ensure that they, even at this point, have no ability to infect broader society. In fact, this facility on the right, the Hamburg-American lines, Auswanderhalle, or migratory halls, was built completely outside of the city of Hamburg, which had experienced one of the worst cholera outbreaks in German history in 1892, to ensure that there was never any kind of relationship between the people who were potentially infected and the broader population. Okay, why is all this relevant to Paris Peace Conference, Treaty of Versailles? A few reasons. First, I'm going to touch on this a little more later, but here you see a regime, what the 19th century regime looks like that attempts to overcome the problem of intensifying border controls. And that's going to be the problem that is going to be discussed at Versailles when you have these populations that are trapped in countries that want or need to move out of them to find employment and livelihood and to prevent revolutionary outbreak. But also, and now I'm going to actually talk about what this building is. The facilities that are created by disease control systems, and I should mention that the German system becomes a model for many other countries, particularly Britain, France views it with envy, the US cites it very positively. So you see these kind of facilities everywhere, and this facility in particular, Atlantic Park, is built in the UK by a consortium of Canadian and British companies as a sort of an analog to the Hamburg facility that I showed you before. It becomes a kind of almost carceral zone for migrants that are trapped between countries. So they're transiting from Eastern European states in the wake of the war, trying to get to the Americas. Of course, the US is increasingly closed off. You probably all know about the 1924 Immigration Act, but even before then, there were increasing regulations against immigration into the US. And so thousands of people are effectively trapped here, some for well over a decade, actually, in this facility specifically. But it's just an illustration of something that's happening all over Europe as sort of transit camps become places where people are mired, and countries themselves kind of become these kind of zones of entrapment for many people. And as a consequence of all this, there's also kind of increasing concern over the transnational regulation of migrant rights. I mean, who's going to guarantee that these people are well treated, given that they're stuck in facilities like this? Okay. So before I finally jump into the Paris Peace Conference itself, I just want to mention one other shift that takes place during the war that's relevant to this question of migrant rights. This is Louis Barret, international lawyer, specialist in employment from Belgium. And he makes the observation that the war changed kind of the social contract in Europe because of the enormous sacrifices that it required of people, and looks at how this affected the way that states thought about migration. And Adam Tooze touched on this a little bit in his talk on Friday, right? The growth of the welfare state as a consequence of this understanding that people had sacrificed for it during the war. And so he notes that because there's this increasingly close bond between the state and its populations, you have two phenomena that take place. On the one hand, you have a kind of increasing concern for a state's immigrants when they go abroad. States want to protect their immigrants more than they used to previously. But on the other hand, states that receive immigrants are more concerned about the regulation of their populations and their domestic spheres. So there's such a huge clash between two more powerful conceptions of the powerful conceptions of the state that have clashing interests, essentially. And they believed that international institutions could provide a forum in which these kind of clashes were worked out instead of becoming potential zones for new conflict. Okay, so at the Paris Peace Conference, and in the Versailles Treaty, a few things happened. First, they explicitly banned German companies from running these border posts on the eastern frontier. But they don't go further than that, really. They sort of stop there and sort of implicitly endorse the sort of border regime that had grown up during the war, even though there are lots of calls to kind of temper it down. And even though there's a huge perceived need to facilitate more movement in the wake of the conflict. Another thing that happens is, as a consequence of this, because there's discussion, at least, of the need for increased movement, thank you, it opens the door for a lot of this discussion of removing the restraints on Asian migration in particular that had grown up around the world. And this was touched on a little bit yesterday in Q&A, right? We heard a lot about the Japanese racial equality clause and how it was motivated by restrictions on migration against Japanese people in Australia. There have been restrictions on Asian migration, Japanese migration, Chinese migration, all over the place, really, in the 19th century, in the US and Australia, in South Africa, against Indians in Canada. And so when the peacemakers at Versailles start talking about, okay, well, we have this problem of border blockages, it's because this is the context in which this problem can potentially become finally resolved. But the issue is this new conception of the state that Barret talks about sets up a real conflict and concern among states about what's going to happen when we receive new floods of migrants moving across frontiers. And this is really illustrated in one of the preliminary kind of meetings in which migration is actually discussed by the peacemakers. And this British minister points out that this is the kind of thing states trying to protect their immigrants in other states abroad. This is the kind of interference in other states' affairs, if this were permitted to happen, that had led to the war to begin with. That's how serious this is taken as a matter of protecting sovereignty. So, the peacemakers couldn't find a solution in which states could engage in kind of self-help, migrant protection, in which they could kind of simply reduce border controls. In other words, they couldn't really find a treaty-based solution in which sort of rules constrain what states did. They thought they could only really punt the issue to institutions that could facilitate negotiations between states in the future. And as you know, I mean, one of the most prominent institution that emerges from Versailles that's now charged with somehow dealing with this issue is the League of Nations. You've probably heard of the League of Nations refugee regime. I'm just going to talk about it a bit briefly. I mean, in the wake of the war, numerous people are effectively stateless. Refugees from the Russian Civil War, refugees from the former Ottoman Empire, they are given effectively protection by this new institution, the League of Nations High Commission for Refugees. Eventually they're issued Nansen passports, and one of the purposes of the Nansen passport is actually to allow people to move across frontiers who were not able to find economic livelihoods in the states that they found themselves entrapped in. That having been said, okay, so first of all, it's a very small part of the overall migration landscape of post-war Europe in particular. But second of all, it doesn't really solve the issue because there's so many states in which there's so much economic calamity that the people who are defined in a sense as refugees are effectively still trapped on the continent. There's a perceived need to try to move them out of Europe altogether, and that requires a much larger institutional solution than merely issuing them passports. There are a series of League of Nations sponsored communications conferences which aim to kind of reduce the level of overall border control in Europe, negotiate it down. These do not produce much beyond standardizing the passport regime so that the passports become more recognizable and legible as documents. And then finally, we heard a little bit in Priya Satya's talk on Friday about the sort of population transfer that took place in post-war Greece and Turkey. And in the wake of that population transfer, there was a concerted effort on the part of the League to kind of bring about a better economic deal for Greeks who had moved into the state of Greece. But this was really only a solution limited to Greece itself, and the League was not willing to sort of take on the broader issues surrounding people being trapped in other states, people lacking economic opportunity in those states. And so what kind of the world is left with is this other institution that's created by the Versailles Treaty that can be, well, it's sort of arguable the extent to which it's actually part of the League of Nations because it receives financing from the League, but it could also be seen as a kind of more independent organization, which is the International Labour Organization, the ILO, which was alluded to a bit by a number of speakers yesterday, in which I'm going to be able to introduce you to a little bit more right now. So in part 13 of the Versailles Treaty, which had to do with labor, the International Labour Organization is charged with a certain number of powers. And here, just from the preamble, is some relevant text. So I sort of highlighted parts of this that will be relevant to creating a kind of ILO regime concerned with migration. The ILO's mission to establish greater degree of social justice was sort of seen as necessary for bringing about a lasting peace, first of all. And you can think already about the unemployment crisis that I've discussed, how it was exacerbated by migratory tensions, and how this would be seen as a social justice issue that would require intervention in order to ensure lasting peace. Okay. Sort of related to this, discussing potential conditions of labor involving injustice, hardship, privation to large numbers of people, as to produce unrest so great that the peace and harmony of the world are imperiled, right? These similar issues that are going to allow the ILO to come in to deal with these economic crises that are produced by the kind of crisis of mobility that I discussed earlier. The regulation of the labor supply and prevention of unemployment are even more explicit. And with regulation of labor supply, you have the question of can this organization somehow take on the power to move people around the world in order to place them in locations where there's need for their labor and remove them from places where there's access to the need for labor. And then finally, on the issue of migrant rights, a movement away from the national paradigm, doing what Marley suggested, which is effectively the internationalization of this question, the protection of the interests of workers when they're employed in countries other than their own, right? So here you have a very, the closest thing to an explicit, actually, invocation of the fact that this is an organization that's going to be dealing potentially with migrants. Okay, so how does this work out in practice? Albert Thomas, the French socialist, becomes the leader of the ILO, the first leader of the ILO, extraordinarily dynamic figure. He presses hard on this question of, if peace requires social justice, the ILO should be given as many powers as possible to provide social justice in order to provide for peace. He wins a number of early victories, and among the first cases at the Permanent Court of International Justice, granting the ILO powers of international economic regulation, or ensuring that those powers are paramount over the powers of states. But he's sort of reluctant to push too far as some labor organizations would want him to go in terms of ensuring that the organization can kind of technocratically move people around the world by itself, kind of as a kind of centralized international migration agency. He's very concerned this is going to produce a backlash among states, that it's going to somehow strip the ILO of its power. And so he moves slow on this issue, and the ILO kind of instead emerges as a kind of broker between states that facilitates agreements between them to try to create bilateral or sometimes smaller multilateral agreements to kind of move groups of people in large number and to provide them with rights. And eventually, the ILO is able to, as Thomas hoped and predicted, start to produce treaties that it tries to induce states to sign on to protect migrant rights more generally. Okay, but the problem with this broker approach is that it required agreement between states over the type of migrants that would be involved in it. And what winds up taking place is, there's widespread agreement between European states that see themselves as overpopulated and that need to rid themselves of excess population, and certain other states and some colonies as well. So you can kind of imagine Palestine emerges as an interesting site for this. There's a lot of lobbying from Zionist organizations for the ILO to become involved in movements to Palestine. Latin America is very interested in receiving European immigrants, and Canada and Australia, certain British dominions, essentially. And what's interesting in particular about the British dominions is one of their motivations for bringing in so many European immigrants is to kind of remove remove the contention among Asian states that have been pressing for, increased inclusion in the international migration regime, that there is space available in these states for their immigrants as well. So you only have agreement over the ability to move Europeans around as opposed to these other peoples that have been pushing for their inclusion in this regime, or at the very least their removal of restraints on their movement. So just to wrap up, I want to kind of bring this together, right? So in both the 19th century and the post-World War I period, you had intensified border regimes. There's attempts to kind of overcome them with new multilateral regimes. There is a difference between the regimes that emerged in the 19th century and the post-war period. That difference has to do with the greater degree of state control and interest in migrants, and it requires a different solution, a sort of larger institutional solution, which emerges with the ILO. But the ILO is still limited because of its kind of brokerage approach to really only European migrants. And My argument for the so what question here is that this sets up the international migration regime that continues in the post-war period to be almost solely concerned with European immigrants and to kind of neglect the interests of migrants from other parts of the world. But that's another discussion for another day. Thank you.
Let's just go straight into questions. I think I saw Sean's hand up, and then let me just get.
Okay.
Caroline will be next, and then Steve. Oh wow, everyone. Okay, all right. Just keep your hand. Sean, why don't you go first? And then I'll.
So this was originally just going to be for Hagen and Martin, but then you brought up cholera, so now it's for you too, Chris. So there's a lot of interconnections in the interwar period with public health and economics as well. The Rockefeller, sorry, I'm loud enough as it is probably. The Rockefeller Foundation, for instance, very clearly views these connections with hookworm eradication, yellow fever, for economic development, things of that nature. The 1866 Istanbul Conference on Cholera outlines 3 of the principles that are outlined at the Lippmann Foundation. So I've got 2 questions for Hagen and Martin related to this, and then one for Chris. Hagen and Martin, when you're looking at the database and constructing these interconnections, particularly with science over politics, are you going to be including these connections with public health in these regards? And second, in what ways are the financial organizations and bodies that you're looking at already setting up the stage for what we see later with the World Bank and the IMF and its involvement in public health financing and loans, particularly with HIV/AIDS, but is this pattern starting earlier than we traditionally think is the post-World War II? And then with Chris, you had mentioned state intervention and whether or not this would be tolerable. I wonder to what degree this increased investment and intervention in public health efforts is because of this migrant issue. And I wondered if you could talk about that more since you brought up the issue of cholera, if trying to address things through like the Pan American Health Organization, eradicating disease in various places, is to try and get ahead of this problem of disease, since limiting migrants is bad for commerce and also violates international law. Just eliminate the problem of the disease at the source so you don't have to worry about containment. Sorry.
Let me collect a couple more. So I have Caroline, Steve, and then Gerhard.
Okay, I have just a brief question to Martin and Hagen. Thanks for this fascinating project of networking kind of intellectual economic history. And I was wondering, we heard a lot of the ILO. So if politics and the state is generally bad, how bad is the ILO and the idea of social legislature and syndicates for these experts here in the city?
Great. This could be a very long question, so I'll try to make it short. And it's trying to draw a broader connection between the two. And just to start with the question of neoliberalism, so you sort of, at some level, the revisionism is to, first of all, push it back, but it's also to sort of show that the state is very present in this neoliberalism. And yes, the state is obviously very present, but it seems to me that there's an issue in both these early phases of neoliberalism and in the question of the creation of the ILO, which is this sort of, the social question is still very present, right? So it's very present in the Lippmann Hayek, or in the Lippmann colloquium about other social aims. It's obviously crucial for the ILO, talking about social justice. But it seems to me that at some level the issue is the sort of depoliticization of the social. Right, so we get into brokerage on the one hand, and we get into this sort of question of how can we, at least in the beginning, deal with social questions that will also have a kind of evacuation of the social. That's clearly sort of trajectory that neoliberalism will take. But it's the move from the new liberalism to neoliberalism in many ways, and to the ILO, is an attempt somehow to depoliticize, and the sovereignty question kind of cuts through this. And so I'm just wondering, sort of your thoughts on, at some level, what are the stakes of this depoliticization, how central that is at once to the neoliberal project, and then to perhaps some of what the ILO is and isn't ultimately able to do.
Let me just collect one more from Gerhard, and then then we'll ask, and then we'll gather another round.
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question to Gordon.
Yes. To Chris. So I guess what became quite clear in your paper is that migration, certainly after the First World War, was very strongly connected to international security, state security, and international security, and it was seen that migrants, if they were not controlled, and migrant flows, if they were not controlled, could bring, well, endanger international order. And you talked about the ILO, and I was wondering whether, so firstly, Thomas, for example, had not higher aims. When I remember in 1927, he spoke at the International Population Conference, he was arguing there for setting up an international settlement authority, invoking all these rights that this authority should have, looking at countries that were overpopulated, for example, and then trying to move them around. And I think this idea is about a larger, in a way, settlement regime probably broke down in the 1930s. And my question now is, in what way was Evian in 1938 sort of an American attempt to reinstate something much grander, where it was initially just about Jews, but I think the way Roosevelt conceived that was that this was a first step towards a much bigger regime that should, in a way, focus generally on Europe and generally on not just Jews, but other minorities and probably much more surplus populations that need to be brought out of Europe to, in a way, peace or pacify the continent. And then jumping into the post-Second World War order, whether with International Refugee Organization and then Intergovernmental Committee for European Migration, this idea was not picked up. And then sort of something that Thomas was dreaming of in the 1920s was established in the early post-Second World War order.
All right. Chris, do you want to pick up from there, or do you need a
Sure, I can try to start. I mean, in terms of the question of eliminating the problem of disease at the source as opposed to trying to prevent migratory movement, I'm afraid I have a kind of a boringly narrow answer to this, which is that eliminating the problem at the source when the source was British India meant that Britain was extraordinarily reluctant to accept this position. Their intervention in these conferences was always to say, we cannot do this, or this is not really possible, and that there's actually multiple sites of origin for the disease. And so the only thing that can really be done is to try to close off the Mediterranean and the eastern frontiers of Europe as much as possible. And so their kind of diplomatic moves are part of what prevents that from taking place. And maybe to some extent also kind of limits to the extent that the colonial state could actually try to eradicate cholera in British India at the time. The extent to which that state regime could really grow in the extent of its capability. Okay, the question of the depoliticization of the social in the ILO is deeply fascinating. And I didn't really have time to talk about the structure of the ILO, but I think that's really important in discussing this. The structure of the ILO is that it's not an intergovernmental organization like the League of Nations. It includes other groups in its negotiations. It's sort of a more corporate enterprise. And so instead of just states, you have what it's called a tripartite regime. So it includes the interests of corporations and the interests of labor. And you have them all kind of coming together to negotiate, right? And so on the one hand, you sacrifice to some extent the theoretically purely democratic representation that comes from only having states represented, right? But on the other hand, you have a different theory of representation taking place in which interests that have significant control in society are able to be represented in a new and significant way in order to sort of answer what kind of also came up in this question. I mean, what's more efficacious? The kind of answer to the efficacy question was to include these different parts of the society. And so there's a kind of a trade-off there, I think, that is seen as necessary in the post-World War I moment. And I think there's a broader question of why that's seen as necessary at that time. I sort of see the ILO, I mean, some people see the ILO as being a kind of revolutionary social organization for including the interests of labor in particular. But I think you can compare it to the rise of corporatist organization in states themselves after the war, and kind of see it as Charles Mayer did in recasting bourgeois Europe, that this is an attempt to stabilize the world in a certain sense, and maybe the trade-off lies there as well, in stabilization, really, in the sense that retaining liberal democracy where it did exist required that stabilization as well. So that's one potential answer to that. The question about Thomas' ambitions, right? International Settlement Authority, he proposed at the World Population Conference in the later 1920s, American kind of aims that come in to kind of replace this when it doesn't come to fruition, and then finally the post-war regime. I think the trajectory that you point out is absolutely correct. Thomas had broader aims than this brokerage kind of paradigm, but he felt it was imprudent to adopt those broader aims immediately. He wanted to kind of gain the trust of states in the ILO's potential and then move toward a deeper regime. And so when he goes before the population conference and proposes this eventual kind of organization that's going to have the power to move people around the world, what he's doing is laying out a vision that he wants to get to eventually, but he's unable to produce in practice. In terms of the American proposals, I think that it's really interesting. I don't know if Evian evidences that much of a grand design. There's the M project during the war. That kind of evidence is more of this. I do think absolutely that ISOM, the Intergovernmental Committee for European Migration, is a kind of post-war continuation of what the ILO is attempting to achieve. And that's sort of one of the directions, actually, of my broader work. I'm trying to show how the kind of bias in favor of European migrants that is held by the ILO as a consequence of what I talked about here is reproduced in ICEM, and that has an effect on how subsequent organizations and subsequent migration governance regime, right? So ICEM is now the International Organization for Migration, how they deal subsequently in the post-war world with migration. So I think that's correct.
Sure. Thanks. Great question, Sean. Rockefeller Foundation was absolutely keen in funding health and the building hospital, of course. Interestingly, Denmark is an interesting case here. Almost the whole Danish health system was developed and supported in the 30s when the whole welfare state was built by the Rockefeller Foundation, heavily funded. And it was sort of like one variation of, hard to imagine, a liberal society where you just provide equal opportunities of being healthy to everybody, as a starting point. Could be a perfectly liberal thought. But in the discussions themselves, when we follow them, health does not play a big issue. No, not at all. More psychology, early psychology, but not health as far as I know. But of course, the Rockefeller Foundation sees those links, and there's an interest in social sciences as serving a larger cause in positioning the role of health. That's true, but not the economists. They don't talk about that much. Caroline, the question on syndicates and the ILO. The ILO is absent in many ways in the discussions. There's nobody of the ILO within these meetings and so on and so forth, but of course they address the problem of syndicates and unions and of social justice in a larger sense. The answer to the unions is very simple. They take them seriously. They also, they take them, it's fine to have unions. It's just that you shouldn't have one. The main argument that they construct is an argument of monopoly. So if we have one or two big unions representing labor or representing employees, then that's too much, because that's a monopoly. And the liberals are against monopoly anyway, either private or public. So, but unions they take very seriously. As a matter of fact, with one of the first meetings after the liberal program in '39 at the International Center for the Renovation of Liberalism at the Musée Social in Paris, is held in front of representatives of unions, trade unions and syndicals, trying to tell them that liberalism, this new liberalism, is actually the true way, a much better way of achieving social justice. Which brings me to the third question, and that social justice is achieved by depoliticizing. it's absolutely central. I mean, you can't say much more to that. You're absolutely dead right. I mean, it's dead center. You need to, tame politics as much as possible, which is the point we're trying to make with moving this to the constitutional level with always, with the rule of law. Because of course, if you have too much politics, you can't get out of hand.
Yeah, of course you can.
Okay.
Even three.
Sure. The one thing is, obviously, the person is William Papa, who was at the foundation of the ILO, and for whom labor questions were important. And the Liberal Code of Women, it would continue even later in neoliberal circles to advocate for compromise with trade unions, not to see them as the enemy of what neoliberalism stands for, but on the contrary, as partners. And this very idea of convincing progressive labor unions to somehow join onto the liberal side and see that the market actually works in their favor, contrary to obviously the planning and communist model, which was very strongly at the time. So there is a real enterprise of kind of charming progressive unions to convince them that actually neoliberalism is not like the liberalism of old times, where workers were seen as really the antinomy to capital. On the contrary, that under the system of the rule of law and of this state that takes charge of some of the basic services, there would be a place for unions to play. And that brings me to the larger question of depolitization. And what's interesting is that, of course, it's a depoliticized question, but they reject the old liberal way of making it an absolutely non-political issue. On the contrary, they're very sensitive to the fact that all these questions are now socialized. And the social question, like when Lippmann writes the Good Society, he says the liberals have abandoned their commitment to social reform, to make liberalism this constant engine of social reform. And they're very sensitive to the fact that if they do not take charge of the social question in their new framework, then they're just going to be perceived as another attempt to reaffirm the supremacy of liberalism based on some kind of natural law of the market, which they are absolutely against.
I think one of the interesting booklets, there's Jacques Left writes the Epître du Régiste in the mid-40s or late 40s, which is a pamphlet. So don't be fooled in making these direct politics and think that's social justice.
Sure.
That's not social justice. Social justice is exactly the other way.
So I have 4 more questions. So Ke first, Noah, Eric, and Tom.
Sure. So question for Martin and Hagen first. You brought up, I saw on one of your slides, maybe the second last slide, but you had also this maybe what comments interesting as well. I think you said it for Pacific relations. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the connections or overlaps, because it seemed like most of the figures you put up on the earlier slides were mostly European. But the Pacific relations was very kind of American. The connection is obviously the foundation again.
Yeah.
So just if you can talk a little bit more about that. And for Chris, as I was going through like my primary sources for looking at the Chinese League of Nations Union, I came across some articles about, as I was going through my primary sources on the Chinese League of Nations Union for my paperwork for this, I came across some discussion of the issue of free migration in the world, the concerns over forced migration due to population pressure. I think some of the writers were concerned about, by the mid-30s, about Japanese settler colonialism in Manchuria, Korea. But that was kind of leading to my question, which is what happens towards the later interwar period and into the early World War II period, where migration and there are new issues about refugees. There was some plan even for settling European Jews in China and Japan in the late 30s. That was discussed. That seems to be a kind of different issue or different set of concerns. But do these new international migration rules come into play in some different reasons in the later interwar period? I don't know if that's.
Are you asking about Asia specifically?
European migrants to Asia. So there was a plan in, I think, in the late 1930s, or discussion between Germany and China and Japan about settling European troops in Asia. So it's not about Asian migration outward, but it's about doing something with European populations.
Got it, yeah.
No, and then Eric and Tom.
Thank you. this was totally stimulating. Just a couple small questions for each of the two papers. Just for Hagen and Martin, I was struck by the centrality of the notion of the rule of law to this emerging neoliberal conception, but by the absence of international legal networks. And so just a sort of two quick questions. First, were these people part of international networks of legal cooperation, like the legal section of the IIIC, or were there lawyers in the group? And if there weren't, why leave the lawyers out when they're making the rule of law so central to their vision of what a harmonized neoliberal society should look like? And then for Chris, I was totally fascinated by the early border control regime, and the connection with cholera I thought was super compelling. And it made me think, though, of some of the other early border control networks in Europe. So I was thinking especially of Rogers Brubaker's work on sort of citizenship and poverty and social control. And that then led me to think of two sort of puzzles that I had for you. One was, what happened to those sort of earlier networks of migration control or ways of doing migration control that were less built on building sort of strong borders in particular, or maybe I'm wrong about that. And then the second piece is that in Brubaker's earlier story, questions of migration and questions of citizenship are sort of inextricable. But in the story that you've been telling us about border control, the citizenship question is sort of less important, and we've talked about this a bit over the last couple of days, so I just wanted to invite you to reflect a little bit on the distinction between being a citizen, being a national, or being a migrant, and how that fits into the emerging regime of border control.
For Martin and Hagen, I was fascinated by the overrepresentation of Austrians, of course, there. And I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit about the genealogy of neoliberalism coming out of an Austrian context, which I also can't help but think is also neo-colonial in some ways, because the Austrians are, of course, part of a German tradition of Beamtenliberalismus, right? Of civil service liberalism, imposing freedom on people who are not yet ready to make the right choices about their freedom. And how that's now being, in effect, transferred to these new international organizations in ways, of course, to assure precisely those freedoms in places potentially that would choose the wrong, make the wrong choices. For Chris, the 800-pound gorilla in the room that I see here is, of course, white supremacy and the eugenic crisis of the First World War, right? I mean, it's the association of migration of Eastern and brown people with disease and degeneracy, the rise of a very restrictive immigration policy all over, the beginnings of apartheid in South Africa, right? I mean, it's really very, very striking, right? How that seems to be. If not always talked about in polite company, it's definitely there, and it's definitely in the nativist politics that many of these places are responding to, right? Yeah.
Tom Berkman. This is for Hagen and Martin. My entry is the IPR, Institute of Civic Relations. I've studied a lot of their work and read their proceedings of their conferences, and the flavor I get is totally different from what you're describing, and that is the lack of the ideological content. The IPR was always talking about just getting people together, getting politicians, academics, and so on at the same table, but there's none of this talk about institutional change or economic systems and things like that. So I'm wondering, is there a bifurcation within the movement? What you're describing is not really present. Just as an example, the president of the IPR of the Japanese Council from 1927 to 33 was Nitobe Inazo. He was actually head of the ICIC as Undersecretary General of the League of Nations in Geneva until 1927. He's a Japanese Quaker and very far from an ideologue. I would not call him a neoliberal in any sense of the word. So is that internationalist element in the movement you're talking about different from what you described?
Very good question. Can I pick it up?
Yeah.
This one, because that's an important point of illustrating how it's not that what became neoliberalism in the 30s emerged in these networks. That's the point we were making. It's, of course, if you look at the 20s, it's a very different story. They talk about many things, trying to get international relations off the ground in the first place. That's the issue there. But I haven't read the proceedings of the IPR in detail. I only read about them, or we come across them when we study the Rockefeller Foundation and what they fund, and when we follow this John Bell Conliffe, who is he's the connection.
I think the YMCA plays an important role in the IPR.
Yeah, I think
And
totally
maybe
agree
in
with that.
China too.
And I wouldn't say that they were ideological in any way, or also later on a self-understanding that this is about making a new ideology. They already talk about that. It was just that we have to do something, and this emerged, these solutions towards the points I was making, shared sovereignty, federalism, they begin in the 30s, as far as we can see within those networks, to be more outspokenly framed and discussed. So maybe the question to the IPR is exactly, Conliffe is not a European, he's a New Zealander, and he begins his career with early statistics, early sort of like data gathering, and then he joins Cambridge, he goes through the war, he joins Cambridge University, he's very impressed by Keynes, and becomes, again, one of the early macroeconomists. Macroeconomy is also invented at the time, sort of gathering data and catering this for the League, because if this is a global order, we need global data, we need some robust material. And Conliffe is the link there. And the Institute of Pacific Relations becomes a model for other research institutes and international affairs institutes that the Rockefeller Foundation sees as a model in order to then, as a template to copy in other countries. So that's partially the relation. And of course, Conliffe becomes the key main super administrator of the Economic Intelligence Service of the League. And if we see any of those graphs of market contraction, you probably see that spiral of global contraction of the markets. They were the first to visualize the Great Depression and all this, and Conliffe was the main editor and author of these reports. Yeah, that's the first one. Two questions. You want to have one? Otherwise, I keep talking too much. Yeah, well,
we can think about.
Yeah,
we can talk about the centrality of the rule of law. It's. I didn't see on my part. I didn't see any direct connection with international networks of legal lawyers and organizations. I think. I mean.
No, it's always. They're always there. The Hague is always there. Among the institutions that are invited to the IIIC conferences, there's always the Academy of International Law from the Hague. Yeah. Plus, many of the Austrians and others, many of the, let's say, elite spots from which they gather their experience or expertise. In the case of Austria, it's the Consular Academy, which is the place where we meet many of the important Austrian legal figures. And it's the Diplomats School. This is the main center. And so the Business Cycle Institute is then represented by that Consular Academy. They get into this network through the Consular Academy. Plus, of course, in Geneva, we have our friend Hans Kelsen as a permanent fellow. So they're there. Lauterpacht is also with it. We meet Lauterpacht. No, not Ash. What's his name? Ash. He's also within those expert networks. They come, but they're not at the local. This is mainly I don't know why, but they're not there. But they're in the wider network. We miss Eric, but we can.
Okay, I'll take some. So on the question of settling Europeans in China and Japan, I should be clear that only part of the kind of migration question is where people are needed economically or where there's sort of economic access, and the other kind of side of this is a question of population density that gets brought up quite a bit in these discussions, and East Asia in particular is seen as being, if not equally densely populated as Europe, very close indeed. And this is a lot of what leads sort of Japanese representatives, at the Paris Conference even, to sort of make the case that Japan should be included in any regime that is settling people who are access surplus populations somewhere else in the world. So it's actually, it makes the case better for kind of inclusion of Asian states in any international migration regime. And it kind of precludes a discussion of moving Europeans into those states instead. Although there's always kind of theoretical discussions of moving people all over the place. So I think that's probably what you picked up on before. So in terms of the relationship of the disease control regime to kind of earlier border control, I call them experiments, border control experiments in the late 19th century, because we haven't really gotten to the post-World War I moment where these are kind of universalized and really strengthened. What I think is really interesting and distinct about the disease control regime as opposed to these other border control methods is that the disease control regime was kind of working against the tendency to impose borders that were detrimental to commerce. Whereas many of the other border control experiments were instituted in order to effectuate commerce in some way. So, the examples I'm most familiar with are from Germany, but bringing in Polish seasonal laborers and having a draconian kind of ID regime for them is part of controlling them for the purpose of ensuring that they work in a given way in the fields in Eastern Germany and don't migrate somewhere else and do something else, for example. The other way that it's related, though, if we think a little bit further ahead into the immediate pre-war period, is, as I mentioned, the disease control regime is kind of an inspiration for other border control experiments. And so, for example, the 1905 British Aliens Act, a lot of the discussions around that statute, which is the first statutory British migration restriction, are directly informed by the German migration regime, and they see this as an extraordinary example that they should emulate. The other question that you had, the relationship of citizen, national, subject, extraordinarily interesting question in this context, because in the kind of post-war crisis of mobility that I talked about, I think a lot of these distinctions are kind of dissolved, and there's a sense that states are overwhelmed by populations in general, and even though people who had German nationality, who had moved in because they found themselves living on what became Polish territory, could have German citizenship because of their parentage or whatever, they could still be considered excess, just as a foreign refugee population could be considered excess. But of course, there's some distinction there, but I mean, there's extraordinary bias against those sort of new German populations, for example. And so that dissolves a little bit of that distinction. And then a question on white supremacy. It's obviously, you can sort of see this as a global moment for the rise of white supremacy, to be sure. It's deeply significant in the decision of Latin American states to want to take on more European migrants. They see this as improving their racial stock, so to speak, and so does Australia in particular with the White Australia policy, for example. It's in an interesting way, it also produces migration restrictions on Europeans because of the sense that when we're thinking about biological racism, there's also the kind of component of, okay, well, you're biologically this way, you belong in a certain ecosystem. And so there's a sense, and this is another part to this question of where people should be moved. There's a sense that European populations belong in a certain kind of geography. They belong in the temperate zone, exactly. And so this gels actually really well with imperial policy, because the British and French empires do not want a flood of migrants from Europe into the so-called tropical colonies. They don't want them to destabilize, whatever regime they have going on in these places. And so they're able to say, and this is actually written into effectively the part 13 of the Versailles Treaty, the ILO Constitution, part that I didn't show you, which says, everything that this part deals with can be limited on the basis of local conditions. I think climate is specifically mentioned as a part of that as well. And so, those, in a strange way, I mean, kind of racial thinking winds up producing a kind of limitation on what Europeans can do and where they can go. But I think, just to conclude, I don't want to conclude on this note that it actually restricts European power or restricts white supremacy too much. It's very much, I think, a moment in which there's a kind of movement beyond actually thinking about empire 100% in terms of a given state that is controlling that empire, and thinking about a kind of you know, you can think of it as a kind of Europeanized semi-colonial regime in which it's actually really interesting because what you have essentially when you know, deeper kind of integration of the ILO regime is proposed is the potential that Britain would be paying to move Polish migrants to Argentina to bolster Argentina's self-conception as a kind of European country. So you have this kind of solidarity of what European states can produce.
Thank you so much. We'll leave it there. So pastry time for 15 minutes.
I still owe Eric has not given. Is it okay?
Oh yeah,
Shall
sure.
we talk about it over?
We can talk about it.
Or
Yeah.
oh, okay. But we'll start again at maybe 5. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Please.